All right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Eric Peterson. I'm on the board of directors for the Psychedelic Society of Minnesota. Really, the purpose of the Psychedelic Society is to build community around psychedelics. We like having these conversations and presentations to educate our members. This is an especially important topic tonight, so I'm excited for everyone to hear Christine McCleave talk about plant medicines, indigenous peoples' rights, and cultural genocide to appropriation. Please just listen with an open mind and an open heart. This is, like I said, a very important topic, and we're excited for Christine to be able to present to us. So the format will be is Christine's going to talk for about 45 minutes or so. If you have any questions, post them in the Zoom group chat, and I will be moderating them. We'll do a Q&A after Christine is done presenting. So with that, I will let Christine take over.
Thanks, Eric. Hello, everybody. Greetings. Dina Way Magani Duke. Diindiisi and Dishinakas, Makinak Waju and Dunjiba, Migizi and Dudame. And what I just said to you in Ojibwe or Anishinaabe language is, greetings, my relatives. My name is Blue Jay. The Diindiisi means Blue Jay. I'm from Turtle Mountain Nation, and I am Eagle Clan. And I always begin my talks with that greeting in my traditional language, as that is very important to me in reclaiming my ancestral identity as an Ojibwe woman, as Anishinaabe, as an indigenous person. So I'm gonna get into a lot of stuff for you tonight. I hope you're ready, fasten up for the ride, because I'm about to try to relay a couple hundred years worth of history and information, and leading up to where we sit right now in the development of conversations around the world about racial equity, social justice, racism, white supremacy, systematic racism. I mean, it's all connected, right? So those are just some of the terms we're going to be throwing out there. But before I get into all of that, I'm really glad to see you all here tonight. For those who are sharing your cameras, I can see you. And I just want to ask everybody to go into the chat and just tell me who you are and where you're from. First, tell me if you are a Black, Indigenous, or person of color, or if you're a white ally listening in to learn more. And then tell me if you're, what sector you're from or what your interest is. Are you a therapist? Are you a researcher? Is this something that you're just, psychedelics are something you are interested in experiencing or you do experience? And then, your location, because although this is hosted by the Psychedelic Society of Minnesota, the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition also announced and shared the post, so we may have people listening in from around the country. So my English name, while you guys tell me who you are and where you're from and what your interest is, so I kind of get a gauge on who I'm talking to. My English name is Christine Diindiisi McCleave, so I go by all of those names. And I am the CEO of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. We are headquartered in Minneapolis. And our mission is to lead in the pursuit of understanding and addressing the ongoing trauma that was created by the US federal Indian boarding school policy. Now, we worked really hard to get that mission very concise, but there's still a lot in there that I'm going to unpack for you. So just kind of looking at some of the chats coming in. Oh, bonjour. Bonjour, Jessica. So happy to see another Anishinaabe use their language. And we have Latina, Indigenous, Quechua. I'm not sure if I said that right. Awesome. A white accomplice. I love that. I love that language. Yes, hi, Eleanor. Okay, great. Oh, hi, Zoe. Okay, well, I am so happy to see some Indigenous people here to support me. Do your smudge for me, please. I already smudged, but if you feel it getting heavy, light a smudge for me. I'm so excited to see so many white allies here. This is awesome. I really am grateful, and I was hoping that the audience would be mixed like that. Okay, so without further ado, let me get into the content. So I've got about a 45-minute presentation, and then because this is a community dialogue, and I think that is the most important part of what this work is about, we're going to have a good amount of time for your Q&A. And so we're going to do that via the chat, but really I want it to be a dialogue. I want to hear your thoughts and questions and responses to what I share. And then we'll go from there. So for me, I always start my talks with historical context, right? That historical context is everything, especially when we talk about racism in this country and the legacy that this country has, that it has never acknowledged, that it has never faced. So the first thing that we look at is the oppression that happened with the beginning of this country. So when we look at, in particular, indigenous people's rights to our plant medicines, that hinges on the piece of legislation called the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978. And I'm going to focus a lot on that, and I'll explain as I go. And before we discuss that law, we have to understand why a special law was needed for American Indians to have their religious freedom, when supposedly in this land of the free, everybody is supposed to have freedom of religion, right? No. In fact, it was a government policy to make our ceremonies illegal, to make our religious or spiritual expressions and practices illegal, and to prohibit those and eradicate those, which falls under genocide or cultural genocide. I'll get into that a little bit later too. So this photo that you're seeing now is a painting. It's a photo of a painting depicting the ghost dance. And that happened in the late 1880s. And that's also the exact same time when boarding schools started to be a federal policy, okay? So this spiritual movement called the ghost dance was prompted by the fact that at the time the US was in outright war with many tribal nations as it was trying to remove them. If, you know, they offered a treaty, and if they said, no, we don't want to leave our homelands, this is where we have lived for generations since we can remember, going back to our creation stories, which consequently, a lot of tribal creation stories also involve a flood, right? So there's like this is, we're talking millennia, and the legal term is called since time immemorial, okay? So they don't want to move. The US says, okay, well then we're just going to remove, you don't want to sign this treaty, we're just going to remove you. And they waged war. So the ghost dance movement was really people taking it to ceremony and praying and pleading to the spiritual powers that be for help as genocide was literally underway. And this strength of our spiritual practices scared the powers that were trying to be in the United States. And they also, coming from a very, you know, Christian Eurocentric perspective, viewed it as pagan, which the definition of pagan just means it's not Christian, right? So yeah, it was pagan, it wasn't Christian. And but they also, you know, put other labels on it that were more like, you know, demonic. It was demonic. It was evil. It was not biblical, and it scared them. It scared them, so they started to outlaw the ghost dance. And that whole conflict about the ghost dance and those prayers for help for our people who were being killed is what prompted the Wounded Knee Massacre. And I'm not going to go into the history of that. There's too much to cover, right? So in a document from 1979 about the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, it was stated, quote, "To the whites, especially the missionaries, their first encounter with the sun dance was a mixture of bewilderment and horror. But their suppression of it as they came to see its religious significance to the Indians was quick and complete. For over half a century, they banned it whenever and wherever possible. In 1921, for instance, the Office of Indian Affairs issued a policy statement to its agents, which said, the sun dance and all other similar dances and so-called religious ceremonies are considered, quote, Indian offenses, end quote, under existing regulations, and corrective penalties are provided. I regard such restrictions as applicable to any religious dance which involves, et cetera, the reckless giving away of property. Oh my God, the reckless, okay, sorry. The reckless giving away of property, because it needs to be capitalized. Frequent or prolonged periods of celebration. Oh my God, really? Frequent or prolonged periods of celebration. Can't let those Indians celebrate. We're trying to take their land. In fact, I continue the quote. In fact, any disorderly or plainly excessive performance that promotes superstitious cruelty, licentiousness, idleness, danger to health, and shiftless indifference to family welfare. I am disgusted reading that. I could not hold back my commentary. I hope you all forgive me, because I really wanted to just read it and let it speak for itself. But you can see that this is clearly racist. That they are coming from their own culture and their own perspectives, their own religious perspectives on what is deemed to be beneficial to people's spiritual health and what is acceptable. And they have condemned our spiritual practices in this statement. And so we were able to get that law enacted. And now today we can perform our ceremonies and dances without persecution, all right? And that was enacted in 1978, folks, that recent, okay? So again, historical context, I got a little more for you. We talk about, at the Boarding School Healing Coalition, we talk about historical trauma as it's not just the boarding schools, it's layers of historical trauma, right? And I promise you this all has a point. So starting with contact, as soon as Columbus got lost in the Caribbean and thought he was in India, he brought disease. He sought to enslave our people and sex traffic our young women. And that is the fact. And we could do a whole nother lecture on that, but you should just look up the truth about Columbus, right? So when we're talking about historical context from a Native American perspective, it's imperative to remember that we have suffered multiple generations, multiple layers of this trauma. And there's some writings and research that talks about 6 phases of historical unresolved grief that Native people, Indigenous people are still dealing with today, okay? So there's the contact that occurs, diseases were brought in, settlers start showing up and starting to colonize our lands. And if we didn't move out of the way peacefully, they waged war, our people were dying. After perpetual war became too expensive for the United States, they created these assimilation policies. The boarding schools were created under the Indian Civilization Act. And obviously the goal was to assimilate us and civilize us into Western society. And after that, There's also the, let's see which so we've got assimilation through boarding schools. And then after boarding schools, they also decided that was expensive to house children at these schools. So then they started the Indian Adoption Project, just place the children directly into white homes with white families, and they'll assimilate even faster. So again, you know, more layers. And that was in the 50s and 60s. And by the 70s, by the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s, during the civil rights era, the American Indian movement also got going around the same time. And so we had this American Indian movement that started the self-determination era. And that's when we started to see a lot of laws being passed, like the Indian Child Welfare Act that would protect our children from being removed from our homes and communities. The American Indian Education Act that said, you know, we have a right to educate our own children and to have a say in how our children are educated, that promotes language and culture instead of prohibits language and culture. And, you know, our American Indian religious freedoms, the sovereignty that comes with, you know, having our own nations that allowed us to do enterprise like Indian gaming. So many of those acts, including one that a lot of people don't know of called the American Indian Arts and Crafts Act. Did you know that if somebody displays something for sale and says it's Native American, but it was actually made in, you know, China or Peru or whatever, that's illegal and they could be fined? So a lot of legislation came in the 70s and 80s that we consider self-determination. And we today are still fighting for our sovereignty and our right to self-determination. As recent as October 2018, the Indian Child Welfare Act came under attack as a Supreme Court in Texas ruled it unconstitutional and said it was a race-based law. Obviously, that judge didn't realize why that act was needed in the first place. You know, if that's race-based, then what about all the federal legislation that the U.S. had to target our children based on race, right? So I could have been a lawyer. I should have been. No. But it's all connected, right? And what is it all aimed at? What's on the slide? What's in the background of that slide? Land. It all revolves around the land and the resources. What is all the wealth in this country right now built off of? Stolen land and slave labor. Okay, so I'm not going to get up on my high horse about that. I am on a soapbox right now for the next 30 minutes, so bear with me. Okay, so the federal policy of cultural genocide, as I mentioned, there was the Civilization Act. After that, there was the Grant Peace Policy, which had a clause in it that allowed churches to access some of these Indian civilization funds. And that is how we got church-run, federally funded Indian boarding schools. So overall, we have done the research. We asked the government for it, and guess what? We didn't get the answers. We asked, how many boarding schools did the US have that were, you know, federal boarding schools? How many children went to those schools? What nations were they from? How many children died or went missing in those schools? In Canada, they've had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that allowed them to give these numbers, that did an assessment and an analysis of the records, and the federal government and the churches brought forth all the records, and they collected testimony from the boarding school survivors. And in Canada, they had 150 residential schools. They call them residential schools for Aboriginal Indigenous children. Here in the United States, we asked the government, they said, we don't know. We don't do research. Those records are spread out all over the place. So we did our own research and we found 367 boarding schools. And that number, it says plus because we keep finding more. That number has gone up over the past few years that we've been doing this research. So to date, we found 367. A lot of times people hear the number 500, but that includes about 150 day schools where the children went there during the day and went home at night. Boarding schools means they lived there for 9 months out of the year. They did not go home. Maybe they went home in the summer. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they were put to work on somebody's farm or in somebody's house as a domestic servant for the summer, and the money went to the school. Okay, so we have found about 367 schools. 64 of those schools remain open today. Okay, a lot of them have been turned over to tribes to be run through the Bureau of Indian Education, where they are much more cooperative and led by the tribal community and include the culture. So we don't consider those the historical assimilative model of boarding schools. But they are still open today, and they still have that legacy. And in the beginning, there were children who were taken, and they didn't speak English. And so when they got to the school, and they might have been coming from different tribes, if they tried to speak to somebody from their tribe in their language, they were beaten. If they did any of their traditions, practices, prayers, ceremonies, they were beaten. When they got there, their hair was cut. You can see the photo here, the before and after. Carlisle Indian School was the first federal off-reservation Indian school that opened in 1887, I think. And that school, General Pratt, actually, he was the one who coined the term "kill the Indian, save the man." He thought it was much kinder than the previous slogan of the time, which was, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. That was the previous slogan. And he said, well, no, you know, they can be civilized, they can be assimilated, they can become like us. And so don't just outright kill them. Kill the Indian in them, but save the man. And he wrote a book called The Red Man's Moses. So you can see the before and after. He created all that propaganda to say, look, it works. It was an experiment at first. Subsequent generations of children who went to these boarding schools may have spoken some English. And by the third generation, they really were wanting to go to these schools to learn trades. My grandfather went to Haskell Indian boarding school to learn masonry. My great-grandfather went to Carlisle. He played football with Jim Thorpe. So a lot of people will tell you it was a real mixed bag in terms of experience. Some people met their spouse at Indian boarding school. A lot of Native American people received a quality education and went on to, from Carlisle alumni, the American Indian Society was formed, which later birthed the National Congress of American Indians. So there has been this double-edged sword of like, okay, so we got educated and we learned English and we learned the system and we learned the laws, and now we can pass legislation to protect our rights and things like that, right? So, but there was also a lot of abuse, a lot of neglect, spiritual abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and that caused a lot of trauma. And nowadays we know that trauma to a child's brain actually interrupts their development. And the ACEs study shows us that as they go into adulthood, that they can have negative health outcomes from that childhood trauma. They can be more likely to have depression, anxiety, obesity, heart disease, autoimmune diseases. I mean, all kinds of things we're learning are coming from trauma, right? And it was this federal policy that inflicted this trauma upon us. So this is more about the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. And it says that resolved by the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives assembled in Congress that the policy of the United States would be to protect and preserve for American Indians their inherent right of freedom to believe and express and exercise their traditional religions of American Indian, Eskimo, Aleut, and Native Hawaiian culture, including but not limited to access to sites, okay, that's important, use and possession of sacred objects, and the freedom to worship through ceremonies and traditional rites. So this includes our ceremonies that involve plant medicines, right? I told you I was gonna get there. It only took me 20 some minutes. As well as the use of eagle feathers, right? So as a a Native person, I have an eagle feather, and it's legal for me to have that because it being our national bird is illegal and, you know, was endangered. It's legal for anyone else to have eagle feathers or eagle body parts, except for Native Americans can have those under the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. So there's a whole bunch of, oops, where did I go? Yeah, there's been a whole bunch of controversy in the last few years about Native students wearing their eagle feathers at graduation. You know, so it's really important that people understand that this is not only legally protected through this legislation, but that this is our culture and our heritage, which has been targeted, right? This was taken away from us as a matter of federal policy. And so what we're trying to do now as society and humanity is unravel and dismantle all this institutional racism that's been ingrained in us, right? So if you ever have a moment where you kind of jump to your autopilot and think like, oh, you know, Indians this, Indians that, or even other cultures, just take a minute to introspect and analyze that. Where's that coming from? You know, is that something I heard, you know, from my parents or my grandparents? Is that something I heard in the media? And I think if we can all do that hard introspection, that we can make these changes, that we can start to understand that some of these narratives have been passed down as propaganda that have racist origins. So in my thesis, which was on Native American spirituality and Christianity, I got a Master of Arts in Leadership from Augsburg. I was at a point in my life when I was looking at all the trauma in my family of origin, and then my mom and my grandparents and boarding schools, and then this whole thing with religion. I was like, oh, this is really, like, you know, I think the idea of Jesus is great. Jesus is about love, right? And he was amazing, and he was like, let's be close to God, and but then all the stuff that comes with Christianity, I was like, oh, I have some deep resentments towards organized religion and what they have done to my people and other people. And, you know, trying to parse that out and be like, oh, well, it was really just, it was humanity saying they were doing this in the name of God. It wasn't God himself or herself, you know. And so I decided I didn't want to do my thesis on leadership development and 360-degree reviews. I had no passion for that. I tried, I started, it didn't go anywhere. And I said, I really want to look at this other issue. I want to look at this intersection of Native American spirituality and Christianity and what has happened there. And it really took me down the rabbit hole because in that thesis back in 2011, the Lit Review, actually, I ended up covering, you know, Native American Church and Peyote and the American Indian Religious Freedom Act and boarding schools. And this was prior to me even working at the Boarding School Healing Coalition, prior to the Boarding School Healing Coalition even being a nonprofit. So it was kind of interesting after, you know, being where I'm at. Like last year, I pulled up my thesis to find something and realized that I wrote about all this stuff, you know, many years ago without remembering. So the Native American Church was instrumental in getting the American Indian Religious Freedom Act passed into legislation. It's worth noting that of independent Native Christian churches, Peyote religion is what some people call it, is the most significant and widespread pan-Indian religion in the 20th century in the United States of America and Canada, with approximately 250,000 members. So pan-Indian just means it's like when I say Native American, or if we say Indian or American Indian. There are over 570 tribes in the United States, federally recognized tribes in the United States. There's some that aren't federally recognized. And some of them, you know, there's like a couple dozen Ojibwe nations in North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, right? So we all speak Ojibwe, but there's literally hundreds of indigenous languages and cultures. So to just say Native American is lumping them all together. And that's what we mean when we say pan-Indian. It's kind of covering, it's not specific to each tribe, and each tribe has their own language and their own culture. And so that's important to note that. So the name for the Native American Church developed from its beginnings in 1919 as the Native American Church to its current name as the Native American Church of North America. Important distinction, I suppose. Structured like the Christian church out of both necessity and belief, the Peyote religion views the flesh of Peyote cactus as the flesh of God, given to them for communion with the great divine. So there's definitely the acculturation and the synchronization of the two theologies and religious terms. And one member of the Native American Church described their experience in ceremony saying, peyote is not a drug, but a powerful means which turns the mind to the Great Spirit and to Jesus Christ. So this is important to know because as I say on this slide, the Native American Church has made peyote synonymous with Jesus. To them, it's the same. So I have my own personal opinions and perspectives on that. I feel it's interesting to note that the U.S. passed Religious Freedoms Act for Native Americans only after we organized as a Christian church, right? Like, oh, it looks similar enough. Jesus is in there. Okay. Suggesting that acculturation of Western symbology is necessary for survival and approval of indigenous ceremonies. So here are some quotes from my thesis, Native American religion by nature of its pantheistic or inclusive theology is more able to incorporate other belief systems and some other religions. That is to say, okay, that was total academic theology lingo. That is to say that our traditional spirituality is inherently open to other perspectives, right? We didn't have a Bible, we didn't have dogma. It was, we call in different tribes, it's called different things in Anishinaabe and in my language. It's Kichimanidu, which is the Great Spirit, which also could be translated as the Great Mystery, right? So there's this kind of humility and humbleness that's integrated that says, yeah, there's a whole bunch we don't know. We just know there's something else besides us. And that there's this interconnectedness. So I think that allowed us to, there's a lot of Native American people, according to the actual research that I did, the study that I did, which was a qualitative study in interviewing people, that there's a lot of Native Americans who consider themselves Christian. And I keep meaning to do a slide, so here I'm going to talk with my hands. There's a spectrum, right? And at one end of the spectrum, we have Native people who say, I am wholeheartedly Christian and I don't participate in any pagan ceremonies. And then we have at the other opposite extreme end of the spectrum, Native American people who say, I am traditional spiritualist. I don't do anything that smacks of Christianity. But like a bell curve, there are more people in the middle blending the two theologies, the two religions, whatever you want to call them, to varying degrees. So that was quite interesting. That those were the results of my study. So it's important to know that for healing, for conversations, that there are plenty of Native people who embrace Christianity, and then there are plenty of people who reject it and say, no, that was forced on us and I don't want anything to do with it. So the Native American Church is an interesting case study in that perspective. So let's see, what do I got next? So now that Native Americans have this protected right to use peyote as part of our ancient ceremonies, I I'd like to talk about the recent decriminalized nature movements and how that affects not only peyote, but indigenous peoples. So this is a slide that I had developed when I was on a panel for the Psychedelic Liberty Summit. And I was on a panel with some other Native women, and this summit was supposed to happen in San Francisco prior to the pandemic, and then they went virtual. And in Oakland was one of the first to pass the Decriminalized Nature Act, whatever it was. I don't have my citation. And they used the word peyote. And the Native community in both Oakland and California, and really around the country, got very upset and said, why are you specifically naming peyote? This is one of our sacraments that's protected under these religious rites. And it's an endangered plant medicine, right? So there's a whole bunch of things that were very upsetting. And so for Native people, we don't need a Decriminalized Nature Act to be passed for us to use this medicine. We already have that right. And there are a lot of people who say, you know, if you're going to do a decrim thing, just don't say peyote, say mushrooms and other plant medicines. And then I know in Minneapolis, we do have a group of people working on it, and I've been in contact and conversation with them. And I have a little bit different perspective than some of my sisters, some of my indigenous sisters. And I say, you know, I think it's a little bit negligent to just take peyote out and not include it in the conversation. I think it should be listed in any kind of public statement, legislation. I think it needs to be identified as an endangered plant medicine. Luckily, we don't have to worry about that here in Minnesota because it does not grow up here. But you know, in the southern states where it is its natural habitat, I think it's important for people to know that, hey, you should leave this one alone, right? I'm not a total expert, but I want to say it takes a couple decades for it to mature. And if you pull it up by the root, it will not grow back. I mean, and this is something that applies to harvesting all kinds of plant medicines that indigenous people know, because we spend time being in relationship with these living beings and recognizing that they have a spirit and that they have something to give to us, and that it's a symbiotic relationship. So we always teach how to harvest, to leave the roots behind, to not over harvest, to make sure that the plant medicines can regenerate. So, you know, people pulling peyote up by the roots and not leaving the roots so that it can regenerate and regrow, and then it takes so long to grow, it's endangered. So this is one of those things that I feel like the psychedelic renaissance and the psychedelic community, the people who love these plant medicines and the potential that they hold for healing humanity, we need to recognize this, and we need to join together as human beings to protect them. And that means having relationship with each other as we seek to have relationship with them, right? So that's what this all boils down to. That's why you're here, right? We're trying to have a dialogue. We're trying to learn. So my little, I'm also an activist. So I live with this legacy, and I live with the experience of historical trauma, but I also live with the healing, and part of my healing is using my voice. You know, coincidentally, Diindiisi, the blue jay, is a communicator bird. It's the jay can vocalize and imitate other birds. It's the messenger. It warns the other birds when there's hawks around. And then even my Christian name, my English name, Christine, named after Christ. The Messiah, Christ was a messenger. And so I use my voice. And so a lot of times using my voice means calling things out like they are. And when I wrote this slide, I was feeling it, and I was like, hey, these decriminalized nature movements are representation of dominance, power, privilege, oppression, and ethnocentricity. To have these conversations and to have these movements without acknowledging indigenous people and our knowledge and our wisdom and our presence in our homelands, right? So I hope people are out there snapping and clapping. So I get a little passionate, and I can use really strong language to get that passion to come across. But I really hope people can look past that, you know, that they don't just see the anger, which is justified, right? There's lots of conversations that have been happening over the last few years with the Black Lives Matter movement, that, you know, there's microaggressions and people policing Black, Indigenous, and people of color's feelings. You know, we get to be angry, right? And unfortunately, if you're white, you need to learn to like take that in, hold space for that, right? So the United Nations also speaks to our rights to access our indigenous plant medicines. Article 24 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples states that we have the right to our traditional medicines and to maintain our health and practices, including the conservation of our vital plant medicines, right? So going back to the decrim thing, we have a right to say to these decriminalization movement people, hey, this is our plant medicine. We have a right to preserve it and protect it. You need to work with us. You need to listen to us. Otherwise, you're violating human rights. Indigenous rights are human rights, right? And for people who are all fans of psychedelic plant medicines, to be violating human rights is quite the paradox. I view psychedelics and our plant medicines as helping to elevate and evolve humanity, right? So also under Article 24, Indigenous individuals, that extends the conservation of our vital plant medicines, also extends to animals and minerals, right? So water, things like that. Indigenous individuals also have the right to access without any discrimination to all social health services, and that Indigenous individuals have an equal right to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, and nation states shall take the necessary steps with a view to achieving progressively the full realization of this right. Well, damn, the United States done violated all of our rights. Yeah, so that's what we're working on at the coalition, is trying to get the United States to acknowledge this, and not just like so the TRC model that was originated in South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, South Africa was the first one to have it. Canada has had one. Australia and New Zealand, which also had boarding schools for their Indigenous children, have done apologies, acknowledgements, and we are now in the era where the TRC model is outdated. I believe South Africa's was like 50 years ago. And now we are moving towards, it can't just be truth and then we reconcile. A lot of people say up in Canada, even after they had a TRC, they're like, nope, reconciliation is dead because you're still being racist. You're still coming onto our sovereign lands and trying to build pipelines. And, you know, reconciliation can't happen if things don't change, if things weren't conciliatory to begin with. So now we're in, we're moving towards more truth, and then we need some space for healing after that truth, and that's why our mission says to understand and address, right? Once the truth comes out, we need to understand it. We need to understand how it's impacted people, both Indigenous, Black, white, how it's impacted this country, and then justice, and not just any justice. We don't just want reparations or redress. We don't want money. That doesn't fix anything, and that's colonized concept anyway. We want transformative justice. We want things to change the racist systems, change the the way we think and the way we interact and relate. So more on the UN Declaration. I'm running over on my time here. I know I told you 45 minutes, but well, we got started about 6 minutes late. So I think I'll give it about 10 more minutes. Okay, so this is just to say that the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples also says we have the right not to be subjected to forced destruction of our culture. We should have had that declaration a couple hundred years ago, but the declaration is only 11 years old. Historical and intergenerational trauma. So Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart coined the term historical trauma. Here's the definition. It's cumulative. It's one's own lifetime as well as intergenerational, past generational, ancestral. And we know that Native Americans are suffering higher rates of PTSD, trauma, mental illness, health disparities, economic disparities, you name it, everything. We're winning at all the negative statistics, right? But what's interesting about that is the road to healing, also as listed by Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, says, one, we need to confront the trauma and the harm that was done. We need to understand it, and then we can heal from it, and then we can transcend it, right? So again, we don't just want lip service at this point. And as part of the Healing Coalition, I have been drawn to looking at our indigenous ceremonies and our traditional plant medicines as a modality for healing the great and deep trauma that we are all living with. So it's all tied together, right? Healing is tied to our rights, is tied to the past, is tied to the racism. It is all interconnected. So in light of genocide, which I guess I didn't have a slide on that, I thought I did, but the definition of genocide, according to the United Nations Geneva Convention, does include pretty much everything that the United States did to indigenous peoples here. Outright killing, removing our children, forcibly sterilizing our women, all of it. And in Canada, the TRC said, this was cultural genocide. And really that was a platitude, because cultural genocide is genocide, okay? So in light of the genocide and ongoing trauma, people need to understand that cultural appropriation, okay? I'm finally getting to some of the stuff that was in the title. You're like, yeah, I thought I was listening in for cultural appropriation. So cultural appropriation is a perpetuation of theft, oppression, and genocide. So Native American people have been using plant medicine since time immemorial. Settler colonization denied our rights to traditional and cultural use of these plant medicines. But once we accepted Christianity, then we were able to protect our rights to peyote as a Christian sacrament, right? I hope you're all seeing this like picture crystal clear, right? So why are people of the psychedelic renaissance and decriminalize nature movements perpetuating historical trauma for Native Americans who have had everything taken from them, have had to fight for our rights, and are still being oppressed, robbed, and treated with racism, inequity, and injustice? I hope you all hear the call, right? In a day and age when racial inequities and injustice abate us at every corner of our modern life, shouldn't those who consider themselves enlightened, awoke, and in tune with nature and themselves and the cosmos be the first to acknowledge the legacy of colonialism that we're living with, the imperialism that pervades our daily life, the privilege and its present day impacts on plants and people, especially peoples who have historically had everything taken from them? Shouldn't participants in the psychedelic revolution acknowledge that indigenous cultures have long held this knowledge and that it is now becoming mainstream and trendy, right? The fact that so many people don't acknowledge, I have another slide coming up on that. It just blows my mind. And it really speaks to how blinded we are. But I'm encouraging all our psychedelic fans, scientists, and advocates to be self-aware enough to realize that we're still viewing plant medicines through an ethnocentric lens, okay? So, oh, there it is. All right. I know Dennis McKenna, and he's so sweet and wonderful, awesome man. And I know, I don't know Terrence, but I know that so many people respect and idolize these two, okay? So I say much love for the McKenna brothers. However, I have to use them as an example that Indigenous peoples have known our role in the universe and we have not forgotten. So this quote by Terrence here, where he's talking about, you know, it says, it's clearly a crisis of two things, of consciousness and conditioning. We have the technological power, the engineering skills to save our planet, to cure disease, to feed the hungry, to end war, but we lack the intellectual vision, the ability to change our minds. We must decondition ourselves from 10,000 years of bad behavior, and it's not easy. Right? Well, what is that bad behavior? It's colonization. It's this idea that that one group of people has all the answers and can take over another and oppress another and enslave another. It's racism, right? It's the separation instead of viewing us all as a collective humanity. So the spread of imperial capitalism at the expense of humanity, that's a Western Eurocentric concept, right? At the expense of humanity and all living things. Indigenous peoples understand the interconnectedness and the relatedness of all living things, including our planet as a living being. And we also have the ancestral wisdom to consider where our ancestors have been. So we look 7 generations behind as well as 7 generations ahead. The settler colonial mindset has deemed Indigenous knowledge inferior, and now they're starting to wake up. And now they're starting to say, like, you know, so again, much love for Dennis, but he says here, you know, you take ayahuasca or you take these plant medicines and then you realize what you don't know. And it's like, we never forgot. We never forgot. But colonization tried to make us forget, tried to separate us from that knowledge. And now y'all need us to save you. You're welcome. So, okay, so I have just 2 more slides. Very important as a segue, right? So I just gave you a lot of like, hey, yeah, Indigenous people have a lot to offer, but please, please, please do not culturally appropriate our knowledge. You always have to cite your sources when you're writing an academic article. You know, capitalism, they like to steal, right? You can take somebody else's idea, tweak it a little bit and be like, yeah, I have a patent and this was, you know, so it was their recipe, but I developed the marketing and the packaging and the, you know, whatever, right? That's stealing. And we have fake shamans out there. And I will tell you all, since you have been wonderful enough to open your heart and your mind to listen to me, that here's a little secret. There are no Native American tribes on Turtle Island that use the word shaman. We don't say shaman. Shaman's like a South American indigenous thing. We do not have shamans. We have medicine people. And so if you ever hear somebody say they are a Native American shaman, ding, 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 that is your red flag to be like, yeah, no. Okay, so this guy, James Arthur Ray, he is not Native, but somehow he got into a ceremony and then decided to replicate it and sell it, and he killed people, okay? You all probably heard about that. That was in Arizona in 2011. And now he's got a documentary, and he's still out there as a self-help guru, making money. Right? Like this is so wrong. And then here's a screenshot of an article written by a Native American man who says, beware of fake medicine men and fake medicine women. So that article, you can Google that, Tim Giaggio, I probably said that wrong, is the author. And that's a good article to read. I also grabbed the advertisement next to it because it says media by and about Native Americans, right? So there's a lot of issues that we're struggling with, and one is representation in the media. Hollywood, you know, still hasn't fully come around to understanding. So it's important when you're thinking about, your admiration and respect and desire to learn more about Native American ceremonies, spirituality, and traditions, that you for sure make sure you're talking to people who aren't trying to make money off of it. You should never pay for that spiritual knowledge. You should give something in return, an equal exchange, right? And give them food, give them some kind of gift. If they need gas money because they came to give you a talk, then, but if somebody's saying, yeah, sign up for my webinar, or sign up for this for $20, and I'll bless you. That's not okay, right? And so just to be clear, what we're being paid for today, the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition is getting the money that the Psychedelic Society of Minnesota is paying us because they value our voice and our perspective, right? So I'm not personally profiting off of this, and I'm also not selling you my spirituality, right? So there's a difference, and I wish I had more time to go into this because we could do a whole nother session on that. Land acknowledgement is one last thing I just want to touch on, because a lot of people, now that they are trying to not be racist and trying to acknowledge, hey, yeah, we did steal your land, and yeah, we're occupying your homelands, right? You can do a land acknowledgement, but there's a few things you should know. If you're going to reach out to an Indigenous person and say, we want to do a land acknowledgement at this public event or on our website or whatever, you should offer that person something in exchange for their time, right? Just like if you were to call a consultant or an accountant or an attorney, you would compensate them for their knowledge and their expertise. When land acknowledgements started being a thing, they came from Canada. They were part of the TRC's recommendations, and the US has taken them on as well. Native people started getting calls all the time, and it's like, hey, look, I work full time. I have kids. I have a life too. You're asking me to take time out of my life to do this. What do I get out of it, right? So just be respectful, and also don't use it as an opportunity to check the box. Say, yep, we did that. We had our land acknowledgement at the beginning of our parade, or we put it on our website to acknowledge we're on Indian land. It's an opportunity to build relationship with people. It's an opportunity to say, first, for you to learn first, like, well, whose lands are these, right? Here in Minneapolis, St. Paul, we're on Dakota land. So reaching out to somebody specifically from that tribe, if you reach out to me, I'd be like, yeah, I'm Ojibwe, these aren't my homelands, right? So that's part of it, is learning and then developing a relationship with those people, not just doing a one-off thing. Western culture and Western society is very transactional, very extractive, right? I'm trying to get something out of you that I want. And whereas our culture is more reciprocal, more relational, right? So that's just something to keep in mind if you want to do a land acknowledgement. There's plenty more resources on our website, boardingschoolhealing.org. We have a resource database if you want to learn more about boarding school history. We have other resources. We have e-news, and if you want to follow us on social media, here are the channels for the Boarding School Healing Coalition, and then I have Twitter and Instagram if you want to follow me as well. So I know I warned you I was going to throw a lot at you. There were so many things also flying through my head. I was like, I wish I had more time to talk about that. But why don't we open it up now to hear your questions and comments, and use this last part of the time we have together to actually dialogue and create meaning together.
Thank you, Christine. That was wonderful. Do you want to, if you want, you could stop sharing your screen if we want to see anyone, or you could leave this up. It's up to you. Doesn't matter. So I will had a couple questions come in here, but the first one that I wanted to ask is about generational trauma, and how long does it take to heal from generational trauma? If
generations.
Yeah, is there a
sorry, yeah, I don't want to be facetious, but literally, I mean, it depends. And so that is a question that we get a lot about healing. And healing is, is not a one pat answer. Healing is a complex thing. Healing can be for an individual. Healing can be for a family. Healing can be for a community. Healing can be for a whole tribal nation or a nation called the United States of America. And everybody's healing journey is going to look different. So even at the Boarding School Healing Coalition, we do not prescribe one particular healing modality. We understand that it needs to be culturally relevant. It needs to be specific to individuals, to their specific trauma. It's a really hard answer, and so it depends on also what you're healing. You know, so for example, when I mentioned my great grandfather went to boarding school, my grandfather went to boarding school, and then my mother was adopted out to live with her aunt. And then, and I share this all the time, so you don't have to feel weird. I know a lot of times some cultures are like, whoa, she's getting too personal, but this is part of my healing journey and this is what I share. So then when I had children, I had custody issues. I gave my child away, my first child. My second child, I didn't. And after a while, in my own healing, I got my first child back. But that is an example of the intergenerational trauma and the intergenerational healing. So the things that happen with my son, that heals him, that heals my mom, that heals me, it heals, you know, so really it depends on what you're looking at, and it can take generations, you know, each generation hopefully just does its best.
Yeah. Thank you. What is the most common form of cultural appropriation you are seeing currently in the psychedelic movement?
Oh, good. Glad you said in the psychedelic movement. I was like, oh God, I see cultural appropriation everywhere. Yeah. Oh, yeah, I kind of need to think about that. I don't know, for some reason, the only thing that's coming to my mind is headdresses. And this isn't necessarily a psychedelic movement thing. And I'm sorry, nothing's coming to my mind about your specific question. Oh yeah, I could say the shamanism, you know, with ayahuasca. Oh my God, yeah. That's a huge cultural appropriation thing. And I know that, and I've had these conversations with other people in the Psychedelic Society of Minnesota. And, you know, there's a lot of indigenous people from Peru who will say like, you know, this is a plant medicine that was given to us and we share it and whatever. But when you have shows on Vice called Kentucky Ayahuasca, and you got some white guy who went to prison and met somebody from Peru and he's like, I'm a shaman. That is cultural appropriation. But the other one that I was going to say is the headdresses, you know, like Coachella and stuff. Like, yeah, don't dress up like an Indian, please.
Yeah. Thank you. How successful has it been to use peyote for generational trauma?
You know, I am not the expert to be able to speak to that. I wish I could do a study. I don't even know if there is necessarily a study that targets that, specifically peyote and intergenerational trauma. So that would be something I would have to even research. So somebody want to Google it for us?
Someone get on it. Cool. Dorothea, did you have your hand raised? Did you want to ask her?
I didn't really have a question, but I just wanted to thank you, Christine, for this incredible talk. This was so good. You know, somebody said in the chat they want to read your thesis. So do I. But I also, I live in Northfield, Minnesota, and Northfield has done a land acknowledgement thing. We took a year to figure it out because Carleton and St. Olaf College both decided, which was amazing, that they wanted to introduce the students each year, the freshman students and the whole college, to whose land this is. And I'm so excited about it because this whole thing came from a young woman in Minneapolis. It was her idea to start doing this, and it has spread all over the whole country now. And that's so great. But here in Northfield, what we did when we made this decision, we said, you know, we acknowledged whose land this was and other things like that, but we said we want to be on a learning journey to bring what has been invisible forward to all of the people who live here. So Christine, I would love to have you come down here to Northfield and talk here and about what you've just shared. It's really good information that most people don't know. And, it's been invisible all this time, and you're making it very visible. And so congratulations on that. I don't think you should apologize at all for anything. and I'll be in touch with you, when things kind of change and we can have gatherings where people can come, because you'd have a big crowd down here with both colleges and the community. So
Would
thank
love
you.
to.
Thank you for
Thank you, Cynthia.
oh, your work is amazing. It's really, really good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My thesis is on our website in the resource database.
Oh, perfect.
I love that. I'm such a nerd. And whenever I hear people who've done interesting research, I'm all like, yeah, I want to read your dissertation. And, it's lovely when somebody says that, because, we took years to write it, and then we're like, is anybody going to read this?
Yeah. I got a couple more. One thing I'm curious about is the current psychedelic movement within a capitalist society. I don't know if you have any comments on that, of trying to profit off of
Gosh, I really appreciate people's confidence in me, but I don't have all the answers for society or for humanity. That's a big one. I'm really glad that you asked that. I do think you're onto something, even asking that question, that it's something we need to examine. And even, we can look at legalization of cannabis, and how, that plant has been monetized, and, is that good or bad? More people now have access to it. It's legal. There's regulations. Now you can see what kind you're getting. You can target, your specific needs. That's all good. But what about when we used to just be able to grow it and have it for free? So I think that's a really big question that society as a whole will have to look at. But it's probably just going to continue the way it is for now. I think, COVID and the things that happened in Minneapolis with George Floyd, and the elevation of these conversations about Black Lives Matter and racial justice are helping to change things on a very large scale right now, but our work is not done. So we still have a lot of issues to tackle.
Thank you. Just had a question come in. How can white people approach working with indigenous communities to do research with psychedelics, plant medicines, indigenous practices?
Don't. Kidding, not kidding. Sorry, not sorry. I mean, I could do a whole other talk, and we do some of this work at the coalition about data sovereignty, right? I wrote an article, and I coined the term academic colonization. That is the same thing where, again, people from the dominant culture who have advantages, privileges, take advantage of the oppressed peoples and extract and make money off of them, right? So really leave the studies about indigenous peoples and indigenous peoples' relationship with plant medicines to the indigenous peoples. And if you, that isn't to say that you can't be involved in their studies, but they need to be leading the studies, right? So if you want to do any type of research with indigenous peoples, whether it's around plant medicine or anything, you can approach a tribal nation. Most of them have developed their own IRBs. So you can approach a tribal IRB and say, I'm interested in doing this type of research. Does anyone in the tribe, or does the tribe have a need for this type of research? And then let them tell you, yeah, we want to research this, we want to research that. Let them lead the research, and you are just lending your services. And then of course you get to learn and research along with them. But I would just caution everybody from doing that extractive thing. And studying us from a potentially racist perspective.
Thank you. This was, it says what counts as cultural appropriation, but what I'm think it's focusing on is like, would mushrooms be considered cultural appropriation? You were talking about peyote, or would all entheogenic plants be considered?
Gosh, you guys are asking me some hard questions. I have to acknowledge that I'm not the expert, and so I am just going to tell you my opinion. And that is that in my own quest for knowledge, I have not found in my tribe any evidence that we used mushrooms as a traditional plant medicine. I do know, I have read about, and I can't remember her name right now, the woman, the indigenous woman from Mexico who kind of brought mushrooms to the forefront. And I can't remember her name. I'm feeling really badly about
Maria
that.
Sabina, someone said.
Yes, yes. So I think, so in terms of, let's just answer something I can. What is cultural appropriation? Cultural appropriation is somebody from a dominant culture taking something from an oppressed people's and trying to pass it off as their own, or trying to make money off of it, right? So you can really get into the weeds with cultural appropriation. Is pizza cultural appropriation? Yes and no. I mean, we did borrow that beautiful food from Italy, but we also bastardized it. So I don't know if they would consider that cultural appropriation. So it just, I would just say, if you're gonna do anything that is borrowing from another culture, just always give credit to that culture, and then don't try to make money off of it, right? Like if I want to learn yoga and I want to make a chart for myself of like a nice yoga routine that I can put up on the wall and write, and just, I should not sell that chart. That is not my tradition. That is not my wisdom to sell, right? If I want to share that chart, I could give it away for free, but to pass it off as my knowledge is cultural appropriation.
Thank you. I'm sure you get this question a lot. How can white people best be allies to indigenous people and practices?
Good question. Yeah. I think it's a process. There's going to be, you know, lots of steps in there, beginning with education, you know, really just being open to listening and learning and unlearning some things. And ultimately, there's a lot of conversations happening around allyship. And one of the more recent things that's come out is performative allyship, right? So don't do that. To be a good ally means you elevate voices of BIPOC people, Black, Indigenous, people of color, right? So kudos to Psychedelic Society of Minnesota for putting an Indigenous woman out here to talk about these issues rather than a white person talking about it, right? Always hand the mic to them. If you are at a conference, I've been invited by some really good white allies that I work with. They invite me into those spaces. One of our funders is like, hey, I want you to come talk to these other funders, these other white people, and educate them. That's how you be a good white ally.
Thank you. Let's see here. What are your thoughts about South American individuals who travel to the USA as self-described medicine people and have ceremonies for predominantly white gatherings with a cost of $100 to $200 a night?
You know, I don't know these individuals personally. I don't know. You know, I don't want to pass judgment. That's a difficult one, right? Because I did say some things about like selling ceremonies. I think for me, personally, it's inherently wrong. Spiritual and money don't often go hand in hand. I mean, it's not to say that you don't need money sometimes to buy the food that you're going to have at your ceremony, right? But yeah, it's a little problematic. I think the whole thing with ayahuasca is very complicated. I know a lot of people are now going down there to Peru and in the Amazon, and it's creating some problems in terms of, you know, it's become a tourist industry. So how does that impact the indigenous peoples? Well, now some of them make money off of it and make a living and they can feed their children. but, you know, is it doing damage to the natural habitats? Is, you know, are they now cutting down trees so they can build retreat centers for rich white Americans? You know, so I think everything, it's complicated. And I would say if you've seen something like that, or if you're planning on going down there, just do your research. I have not been to Peru to do ayahuasca. I want to go, and I've talked to a lot of people who have gone, and they say there's definitely differences in some of the retreat centers, right? Some of them are much more authentic, and will give you an experience that actually puts you in relationship not only with that beautiful plant medicine, but with those beautiful indigenous people.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's something in the Psychedelic Society we recommend people, if you are going to go to a retreat center, to go to one where you knew someone previously attended it, to get some firsthand information. Because, yeah, there are a lot of ones out there where you might not have the experience that you're looking for. Would you specifically recommend that non-indigenous people avoid peyote plant medicine ceremonies, or would you recommend finding a legitimate Native American group to try this with?
Man, you guys are tough. Wow, look at the time. I gotta go. Shoot, man, that's such a hard question. Again, I can only speak for myself. And I would say, here's a good way. We like to tell stories, right? So here's a story for you. I myself, and also a disclaimer, I myself have not done peyote, okay? So I probably should have said that at the beginning. I did in my last presentation. I've studied it. I've talked to people who've done it, who have that relationship with the peyote ceremony. I've talked to people in the Native American church. I have been invited to different ceremonies. And for me personally, I don't want to do the ceremony that is in the Native American church. I want to accept one of the invitations from one of my indigenous sisters who has been doing that ceremony in her family for generations. So that's me personally. I would say, again, with the same question about ayahuasca and all of this, just do your research, ask a lot of questions. You know, who are these people that you're going to do ceremony with? That's the other thing too. Like, I don't want to just go into ceremony with anybody. I certainly don't want to go into ceremony with strangers. So I would just encourage you to do your own soul searching. And like Eric said, talk to other people. You know, what have they done? But it's not to say, no, if you're indigenous, if you're not indigenous, you can't ever do peyote. I don't think Creator put that plant medicine here just for us. But I think it's important that people acknowledge we were the first ones to have a relationship with that plant medicine, with that plant relative. And so we are the stewards of that relationship, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do more listening than just going out and trying to do whatever you want. So one thing that kind of stuck out to me is when you said peyote is described as the flesh of God. And often when I talk about psychedelics and psychedelic therapy, I often describe them as tools, but I wouldn't want to use peyote. I wouldn't want to call it a tool because peyote is viewed as a living entity. So I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, if you know what I mean. Peyote is more than just a tool for healing.
Yeah. Well, they're all living, right? So in that respect, I don't think, because what I've read and what I've heard from people who have done ayahuasca is that it's an entity. It's Mother Aya, right? Or grandmother, or that there's a spirit that belongs to that plant. And so I do know that different, not to be pan-Indian here, but sometimes we have to be, but different indigenous cultures have these relationships with these different plant medicines, and we all have the common understanding that they are living beings. And in theological terms, it's called animism, that we believe the wind has a spirit, that all the things that are around us in nature have a spirit. Even rocks have spirits as mineral beings. The water has a spirit, right? So these plants, obviously, these plants that have this great healing potential come to us as living beings with their own spirit. So really, getting back to my thesis, use whatever language and whatever construct works for you to understand it, right? If you're white or native or black or person of color, whatever you are, it doesn't matter. You can use Christian terms to describe it, or you can use New Age terms. You can use Hindu terms. If you want to apply other ancient theologies, just always cite your source, give credit. If you want to make a spiritual salad or soup, go ahead, throw all those things in there, but just remember the source of where they all came from, and honor those people and those ancestors that passed on that wisdom and that knowledge.
Thank you. Any other questions? Comments, anyone? Words of praise?
Phew, good.
Yeah. Well, Eric,
Yeah.
hi. I think we all should give really, butterfly wings, clapping, thumbs up, huge
Yes.
words of praise. Because, what you shared is a lot of information that doesn't come to white people very much. It doesn't. And you're sharing it, and thank you. So I'd like to hear everybody shout out or clap or do something. What can we do, Eric?
Everyone, look at the comments. Everyone's saying thanks right now. This was awesome, Christine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, and just to let everyone know, this will be recorded, and then I will also be saving the chat feature. Some people had some good comments in there, so we can send that out as well. Yes, Christine said to go to her website if you want to read her thesis and to access other resources as well. I hope everyone benefited from this presentation. Again, this was wonderful. Thank you, Christine. Yeah,
Thank you.
Any final words, Christine?
Yeah, I'm just I'm really touched, and this is why I do this work. To know that so many people wanted to hear these things, even though they're hard to hear sometimes, especially if it's the first time you've been hearing these perspectives, or if it's not the first time, but you're taking it in a little bit more. I just applaud all of you, and thank you to all my Indigenous folks who joined in to support. And really, your praise and your thanks, it means a lot, because this is why I do this work, on a Thursday evening, because it's my passion. But also in humility, I told you guys, I don't have all the answers, and I definitely am not somebody who's, trying to be like a medicine person or a spiritual guru. I'm definitely not a shaman. So just, take whatever I said with a grain of salt. Hopefully it opens your mind and your heart to learning more and moving along further on this journey, and bringing more people have conversations about this chat that we all had with your friends and relatives.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming in here. If you want to become a member of the Psychedelic Society, you can join us on Meetup, through Meetup. We have a paid supporting membership. So again, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Christine, again. And take care. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Many thanks, Christine.
See you, Wabbleman.